Hey, all, today we are going to talk about another type of expression that we can factor. They're still quadratic. We still have these squareds. And we have a special case where we have a difference of squares. So this is a special case. And let's look at this name. Difference means to subtract. And then when we say squares, we're talking about perfect squares. So what we have here is this special case where we can factor the subtraction of perfect squares. So we'd be subtracting two perfect squares. Um, you might not know perfect squares. You might know what perfect squares are. Let me talk about them quick. A perfect square is any number that I get by multiplying the same number by itself. For example, 1 times 1 is 1. 1 is a perfect square. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 is a perfect square. 3 times 3 is 9. 9 is a perfect square. And we can keep going. So we have 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100. These are the first 10 perfect squares. And what's nice about these numbers is you can square root them and you get a whole number. Square root is the opposite of a square. So for example, 9 squared is 81. 9 squared is the same as 9 times 9. That's 81. So the opposite of 9 squared is the square root of 81, which is 9. More on that later. So if you can recognize some of these first 10 perfect squares, you can sort of be able to factor these special cases quickly. If you don't recognize them and you don't recognize that you have a difference of squares, that's okay. We can always factor these the way that we did trinomials in the last lesson. I can graph them. I'm going to change n to x, so 16x squared minus 1. So I graph this and I can find the x-intercepts, and I'm looking at my x values so that I can figure out my factors. We have a decimal. Again, if you don't know what 0.25 is as a fraction, you can type that in there and hit the fraction button and find that it's 1/4. And so you'll see that the two x values are negative 1/4 and positive 1/4. And so what you'll notice when we go through these problems, you'll notice that the x-intercepts are both the same fraction, just one's positive and one's negative. And what we would have done in the previous lesson is solve these. I would multiply both sides by 4. Move this minus 1 to the other side, and it becomes positive. And so my one factor is 4x plus 1. I could do the same thing here. Multiply by 4. Move my 1 to the other side, it'll change its sign, and I'll get 4x minus 1. So we have similar factors. The only thing that's different is one is a plus 1 and one is a minus 1. And so when we have perfect squares, we can find their factors by using this specific pattern. We are going to have two factors. One's going to be a plus, one's going to be a minus. Each of these is going to get an n. And then we're going to square root this number, and we're going to square root 1. So let's square root 4. If you didn't know that the square root of 4, oops, square root of 4 is 2. 2 times 2 is 4, so the square root of 4 is 2. Put that there. And then we're going to square root 1. Square root of 1 is 1. 1 times 1 is 1, so the square root of 1 is 1. So there's our two factors. That's using sort of the shortcut method. 4 is a perfect square, 1 is a perfect square. So I'm going to have two factors, one that has a plus, one that has a minus, and we can fill out the rest of it by square rooting the 4 and the 1. Well, let's see how that works if we were to actually graph it. If I were to graph it, I'd see my x values are negative 1/2 and positive 1/2. If you don't know that 0.5 is 1/2, that's okay. You do 0.5 right there, hit the fraction button. So x is negative 1/2 and positive 1/2. I would solve these by multiplying by 2, moving the negative 1 over, and getting 2x plus 1. Hey, that's what I got. Except it's n. Sorry, I have to change it to x when you plug it into Desmos. Multiply by 2 here. Move the 1 over. I get 2x minus 1. And that's what I had here. So you can do this the normal way where you graph it, or you can square root these numbers. If you notice, it only works if they're perfect squares. So you'll have to maybe make a note of these perfect squares so that you can start recognizing. The more of these you do, the more you'll recognize which ones are perfect squares. And again, if that's something you forget, you can always use the method where you graph them, like we did here. So here I have 25 as a perfect square. 9 is a perfect square. We're subtracting. It's got to be subtraction. So we have a difference of squares. So we're going to have two factors, one that has a plus in it and one that has a minus. Each of them is going to have a b before the operation. And now I need to square root 25. Square root of 25 is 5. So we're going to have a 5 here and a 5 there. I'm going to square root 9. The square root of 9 is 3. Each of them gets a 3. And I have my expression factored without graphing, without doing any solving. I've just noticed that I'm subtracting two things that are perfect squares, and so I know that they have to have factors that look like this. So I want you to try this one on your own. If you have to graph it, graph it. If you want to use this method, use this method. In the end, it really doesn't matter as long as you know how to get the factors. So pause right now, give it a try, and then press play and check your answer. So hopefully you got 3x plus 2 and 3x minus 2. If you put them in the different order, 3x minus 2, 3x plus 2, that's okay. It doesn't matter which parentheses comes first. 9 is a perfect square, and the square root of 9 is 3. 4 is a perfect square. The square root of 4 is 2. That's how I get these numbers. We're doing subtraction, so that means we're going to have a plus and a minus here. And that's what you get. If you would have done, if you would have graphed this, you would have gotten x equals negative 2 over 3, and x equals positive 2 over 3. And if you solve those two things, you still would have gotten these two factors. So as always, if this thing is tricky for you, please do ask for help. This is one of those things where the more you do it, the more you'll recognize the pattern, the easier it will get. Practice is always the best way to get better at this, so make sure you do some practice. I do have a few that I want you to do. There are 4 here that I'm going to ask you questions about. Please make sure you answer those questions. And again, ask for help if you need it. Do some practice. Good luck.